Thank you all for showing up tonight. First off, I would like to thank you on behalf of the Irvine Valley College MUN team. All of the funds raised tonight will go towards supporting the team and allowing us to attend conferences to compete. In MUN, or Model United Nations, students from schools all across the country come together to, surprisingly, model the United Nations by representing individual countries and their interests while debating real global problems. Tonight we have 5 members of our MUN team here to discuss the various pressing global issues. Our first panelist discussing the effect of climate change on sustainable development is Audrey Meany. This is Audrey's first year at both Irvine Valley College and MUN. She has competed in NMUN-DC and Santa Barbara Intercollegiate MUN, where the team has won Outstanding Delegation Awards. Additionally, she has won a committee award at SoCal MUN. She plans to transfer to UC Berkeley, where she will major in political science in hopes of becoming an UN ambassador or political analyst. Please welcome Audrey Meany.
Thank you. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the impact of climate change on sustainable development. Now, what is sustainable development and what does it have to do with climate change? Sustainable development refers to a mode of human development in which resource use aims to meet human needs while preserving the environment. This is so that needs can be met not only in the present, but also for generations to come. In short, it's a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In achieving sustainable development within the international system, the understanding of the manifested effects of climate change on states and what those changes have meant both environmentally and economically is key. How does this relate to climate change? Well, climate change is a significant and lasting change in the statistical distribution of weather patterns over periods ranging from decades to millions of years. This could be a change in average weather conditions or in the distribution of weather around the average conditions, such as fewer extreme weather events or even more. Climate change is caused by factors that include oceanic processes, variations in solar radiation or sea fire, plate tectonics and volcanic eruptions, and human-induced alterations of the natural world. These latter effects are currently causing what is known as global warming, and some of these specific effects of climate change have been manifested in changes in the global freshwater resources, land and forestry resources, food and agricultural production, and increase in large-scale and environmental disasters. Take freshwater, for example. With respect to resources, water is one of the most essential and basic requirements for human life. It is so important that the access to safe and clean drinking water and sanitation as a human right was officially recognized in the General Assembly resolution. Thus, any effect on climate change on freshwater resources fundamentally affects the human life and the chance for successful sustainable development. The most serious changes in freshwater resources include a reduced water holding capacity of the atmosphere, greater variability in stream flow resulting in decreased water supply, and decreasing water levels. Each of these effects, combined with the stresses of water, will affect human activity, including the ability to remain self-sustaining. For example, one of the most integral human uses of water is irrigation, accounting for 90% of global consumption water use, which has seen an increase in recent years due to decreased precipitation and increasing temperatures. Similarly, food production is impacting sustainable development. Food production has faced tumultuous effects as a result of global climate change. Agriculture and food production is indispensable to human survival. Currently, 40% of land is managed as cropland and pasture to support that livelihood. Yet that land is increasingly faced with the stresses of climate change, including soil erosion, over-extraction of groundwater, the buildup of pest resistance, and the loss of biodiversity, among others. In addition to these land resources, currently 2.6 billion of the world's population relies on fisheries as a part of daily nutrition. But 3/4 of global fisheries are currently fully exploited, overexploited, or depleted. It is clear that the challenge the international community faces is striving for new environmentally friendly methods of food production, while at the same time maintaining consistent levels of output. While it is possible that we can find ways to replace some natural resources, it's much more unlikely that they will ever be able to replace ecosystem services, such as the protection provided by the ozone layer or the climate stabilizing function of the Amazonian rainforest. In fact, natural capital, social capital, and economic capital are often complementaries. A further obstacle to sustainability lies also in the multifunctionality of many natural resources. Forests, for example, not only provide the raw materials for paper, which can be substituted quite easily, but they also maintain biodiversity, regulate water flow, and absorb CO2. Another problem in natural and social capital deterioration lies in their partial irreversibility. The loss in biodiversity, for example, is often definite. The same can be true for cultural diversity. For example, with globalization advancing quicker, Quickly, the number of indigenous languages is dropping at alarming rates. Moreover, the depletion of natural and social capital may have non-linear consequences. Consumption of natural and social capital may have no observable impact until a certain threshold is reached. A lake can, for example, absorb nutrients for a long time while actually increasing its productivity. However, once a certain level of algae is reached, lack of oxygen causes the lake's ecosystem to break down suddenly. The sustainable development debate is based on the assumption that societies need to manage three types of capital: economic, social, and natural, which may be non-substitutable and whose consumption might be irreversible. The Venn diagram of sustainable development has many versions, but first was used by economics Edward Barbier in 1987. It shows the overlapping of 1 part social, 1 part economic, and 1 part environmental. Between social and economic, you have equitable. Between social and environmental, you have bearable. And between environmental and economic, you have viable. But only between social, environment, and economic do we have sustainable. Recently, governments have been coordinating outside of regional commissions to try to dissolve the issues at hand. One example is the coordination between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the BRIC states. They had created resolutions such as the Delhi Declaration of March 2012, which reaffirms the commitment of BRIC states to sustainable development, as well as briefly outlining the challenges that these countries face in the implementation of successful developmental models. One of the important points to note in the declaration was the affirmation of the commitment by developed state party to the UNFCCC. The UNFCCC is an international environmental treaty whose objective is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. This treaty is non-binding, but provides a framework for negotiating specific international treaties that may set binding limits on greenhouse gases. By committing themselves to this treaty, they have ensured that they will strive to develop a green economy and avoid barriers with respect to trade and investment. Now, while climate change has always been a prevalent issue, it has only become pertinent within the last decade. Largely, the push has been for a collaborative and supportive international community, much like that of the BRIC states, only on a larger scale, such that all interested stakeholders are able to access technical resources, and further, that developing states are provided with the investment necessary to undergo sustainable projects. One unique initiative that has come out of the international community has been through the UN Global Compact. The Global Compact goes beyond government involvement in action and pushes for the private sector and business to take up their own tools and frameworks to combat climate change at the front end. The Caring for Climate program is the most recent Global Compact plan and commits business leaders to effectively reducing their carbon footprint through employing low-impact technologies and increasing energy efficiency. These types of initiatives encourage a dissemination of responsibility amongst relative stakeholders and create obligations upon the private sector to combat climate change from the start, which mitigates the number of retroactive tasks that must be completed once damage has already taken place, and allows states to focus on sustainable infrastructure as a whole. The overarching progress that has been made in the realm of sustainable development has been monumental over the last 20 years, starting with the global recognition that the climate change not only exists, but poses a significant threat to the livelihood of the international system. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Audrey. Up next is Max Hyman. Max joined MU1 last spring and has been extremely active in attending multiple conferences and winning multiple awards, as well as being an assistant director for SoCal MUN. He plans on transferring to UCLA to major in business and accounting, and furthermore, attending Columbia for law school. After that, he plans on opening up his own firm as a defense attorney, or possibly being a broker or an accountant. Here to discuss the effect of job creation on sustained, inclusive, and equitable economic growth is Max Hyman.
The topic of my lecture is a fair globalization for all. The effect of job creation on sustained, inclusive, and equitable economic growth. I would like to pose two questions for everyone to generate your own economic thoughts before I explain my own beliefs. 1. How has trade agreements impacted employment? 2. What improvements can be made to stimulate the global economy while increasing job creation efforts? While researching for tonight's policy forum, I came across a very simple yet powerful quotation that sums free trade in 3 short sentences. Free trade may be the best solution in a perfect world, but we don't live in that world, and for the sake of the poorest people, ideological straitjackets must be dropped and facts acknowledged. What does free trade really mean, and what are the ramifications in a capitalistic economy? As one of the nation's leading economists and Nobel laureate, Paul Krugman emphasized, free trade is a policy by which a government does not discriminate against imports or interfere with export by applying tariffs to imports or subsidies to exports or quotas. A tariff is either 1, a tax imposed on imports or exports in and out of a country, or 2, a list or schedule of prices such as things as rail service, bus routes, and electrical usage. There are several issues to consider, none more prevalent than sovereignty. Our nation's tariff policy does not always equate to another nation's tariff policy, causing confusion and economic gridlock. Further, not every nation utilizes the same form of currency, which has extreme influences on international trade. A very interesting economic article I came across, originating in the United Kingdom, theorizes on the implications of exchange rates. The article concludes, on a very fundamental level, exchange rates impact overall exports, imports, and trade balance of a country. A higher exchange rate will lead to a rise in imports and fall in exports, which means depreciating of trade balance. This is because customers will find it cheaper to buy imported goods, and there will be a tendency to source intermediate goods with other countries. Similarly, devaluation of currency will lead to soaring of exports. This will lead to appreciation of general trade balance as imports get expensive while exports get more competitive. The article touches on economic factors that are amongst the leading factors for creation of a fair globalized economy for everyone. I want to shift gears back to free trade policy. Under a free trade policy, prices emerge from supply and demand and are the sole determinant of resource allocation. Since the mid-20th century, nations have increasingly reduced tariff barriers and currency restrictions on international trade. None more famous than the North American Free Trade Agreement, commonly referred to as NAFTA. NAFTA is an agreement signed into international law by Canada, Mexico, and the United States of America, creating a trilateral trade bloc in North America. The bill came into action and has been implemented in numerous economic transactions since its inception on January 1st, 1994. You might be asking yourself, why would the international community increasingly reduce tariff barriers and currency restrictions? The answer lies in the 19th century economist David Ricardo and his theory of comparative advantage. In economics, the law of comparative advantage refers to the ability of a party to produce a particular good or service at a lower marginal and opportunity cost over another. Even if one country is more efficient in the production of all goods than the other, both countries will still gain by trading with each other as long as they have different relative efficiencies. Trade only occurs when both parties mutually benefit, otherwise there is no financial incentive to work together. I want to read an example from an economic textbook to further explain the advantages of tariffs in a free trade market. Assume that America wants to protect a domestic industry that is only able to produce and sell widgets at a price of P tariff. Since there are other countries that are exporting the same widgets at a price of P world, America's industry is threatened to go out of business should widgets be imported into a country without a tariff. As long as the price of P tariff does not fall above the intersection of supply and demand lines, then an equilibrium can be reached in which there are no shortages of demand or excess of supply, and so America's industry can produce and sell widgets to the same degree as manufacturers in other countries. Currently, the World Bank believes at most tax rates of 20% can be allowed for developing nations, but this view is not shared by the entire economic realm. As one of the leading heterodox economists and institutional economists specializing in developing economics, Ha-Joon Chang concludes, higher levels of tax rates may be justified because the productivity gap between developing and developed nations is much higher than the productivity gap which industrial countries face. Now let's quickly reflect on the disadvantage of having tariffs in a free trade market. There are three main effects on societal welfare. Consumers are made worse off because the consumer surplus is smaller. Consumer surplus is the monetary gain obtained by consumers because they are able to purchase a product for a price that is less than the highest price they would be willing to pay. Producers are better off because the producer surplus is much larger. Producer surplus is the amount that producers benefit by selling at a market price that is higher than the least that they would be willing to sell for. Unfortunately, the result of having a tariff is the formation of deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is the reduction in economic surplus resulting from a market not being in a competitive equilibrium. Further, the federal government has additional tax revenue. However, the loss to consumers is greater than the gains by producers and the government. Therefore, removing the tariff and having free trade would be a net gain for society. Globalization refers to economic integration and the transfer of policies across borders and transmission of knowledge. The United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon pointed out, while free trade has brought a large array of new opportunities and benefits, the increased interdependence that has accompanied these movements has left countries and their populations more vulnerable to external shocks and economic insecurity. Further, globalization has also been accompanied by rising inequality both within and among countries. In recent years, dating back to the late 1990s, the ability to work has been compromised as employment opportunities fester and in most cases completely diminish. There are some sad hidden truths about economics that require a tough stomach to digest its merit. With increased numbers of individuals unemployed, there is increase in the burden of tax to be covered by individuals who are currently employed. Is it justifiable to have hardworking individuals who are struggling to keep up with their own bills and other expenses to reach deeper into their pockets to pay for others who are not earning any income? Where is the line drawn? In economics, it is essential to think rationally and to not allow one's emotions to dictate the outcome of any financial decision. That is not to say ethics are to be dismissed. Rather, ethics should be utilized only when our reason dictates its effectiveness. There is no economy in the world today that functions without human inputs. Article 23 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights explains that everyone has the right to work. Article 23 goes on to further explain that everyone has fundamental human rights to choose their place of work, receive equal compensation in the form of wages for labor, and to join unions to protect their interests, generally in the form of a collective bargaining agreement. One thing Article 23 does not mention is the incidence of taxes, under which the criteria, the burden of taxes fall upon the elite. In a successful capitalistic economy, for example, the United States, during the real estate spike of the early mid-2000s, there was a huge income disparity between the top percent and the bottom percent of citizens. There has to be rich citizens who create the jobs and accumulate a majority of the income, just as there has to be poor citizens who work in jobs and accumulate a minority of the income. If you don't believe me, ask the former Soviet Union and their economic principles of communism. If we are able to globalize the economy for everyone, we too must assess the marginal utility of each job. In economics, the marginal utility of a good or service is the gain or loss from an increase or decrease in the consumption of that good or service. We cannot logically infer that the marginal utility of the CEO of Berkshire Hathaway is equivalent and or less than the marginal utility of a mailman. Warren Buffett might not work as many total hours in a week as a mailman. However, the gain in consumption from Buffett working, the service he provides, is substantially greater than that of a mailman. Point in case, mailmen make under $50,000 a year, and Buffett, well, you can add at least 5 zeros to the end of the mailman's salary. Back to the questions I posed earlier in my speech. How has trade agreements impacted employment? Trade agreements have impacted employment by shifting the location of jobs to other countries through the process of outsourcing. Outsourcing includes companies taking a function out of their business and relocating it to another country. The total jobs in terms of volume has not decreased. If anything, they have increased. This is because lower developed countries do not have labor laws to the likings of America. Lots of countries do not have workers' comp, child labor laws, time restrictions, lunch break requirements, minimum wage requirements, and much more. This allows companies to cut expenses while still maintaining the same level of productivity and often a higher level of productivity. Companies can now hire more employees for the same price it costs them to hire half as many employees, say in a country like America. This results in a higher probability of higher net profits for companies, which is financially beneficial. This, however, hurts the employees who lost their jobs through the outsourcing to lower developed countries. What improvements can be made to stimulate the global economy while increasing job creation efforts? Government can provide incentives through tax breaks for citizens who wish to start small businesses. The whole issue of increasing job creation is privy to there being an incentive for a citizen who has the means to create new jobs, being beneficial for him to do so. If we are more concerned with international job creation, then I propose the federal government suspend tariffs, which makes it extremely costly to do business outside of America. Also, in an attempt to increase the desirability to create new jobs, the federal government should increase the one-time special deals for depreciating expenses. Currently, I believe in California you can write up to $250,000 in straight-line depreciation for one item for 1 year only. The theory being that instead of paying to repair a machine, the company purchases a newer model of the machine so the economy benefits. I want to end with a quotation from one of my favorite economists, Friedrich Hayek. Even the striving for equality by means of a directed economy can result only in an unofficially enforced inequality, an authoritarian determination of the status of each individual in the new hierarchical order. I want to thank everyone who came to listen to the Global Policy Forum, and I hope my speech was entertaining. Thank you.
I'll press the red button.
Thank you, Max. Up next, we have David Sadakane. This is David's first year at IBC, as well as being his first year in MUN. He's majoring in political science with hopes of attending George Washington University. Here's David Sadakane.
Thank you, Theo. Everybody, my presentation will be on the promotion of the peaceful use of outer space and preventing an arms race. Just a little bit of background on this topic. Space has been used for many things in recent history, and one of the new horizons for military technology is to put military technology in low Earth orbit. For this, it comes to the potential of the United Nations that promotion of more peaceful uses and that prevention of a possible arms race in the militarization of our orbit. So first, I'm going to do a loose definition of outer space. Outer space, in terms of this PowerPoint, will be basically everything except for our planet. It is loosely defined in international law as the Kármán line at 62 miles of elevation. However, the United States has its own definition, which is at 50 miles. Basically, in terms for this, we're going to have to define everything except for Earth, which is a partial vacuum of space containing all localized matter and celestial bodies, stars, planets, and comets, asteroids, everything. So for a little bit of historical background. The original space race began at the advent of World War II, Nazi Germany. The first development of the V-2 rocket, the first man-made artifact into lower Earth orbit. These were the V-2 missiles. These ballistic missiles were launched from a platform and hit remote targets in other countries, and they were guided by gyroscopes. However, they utilized the lower gravity and propulsion of orbital velocity to reach their targets that were far out of reach of any conventional airplane at the time. Following the fall of the German regime in 1944, the three states, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain, had a rush to gain access to these technologies through the scientists that were working in Germany at the time. This culminated in the first artificial satellite to be put into lower Earth orbit, Sputnik, Elementary Satellite 1 by the Soviet Union in 1957. This was a great awakening for the American public as it led to the Great Scare. If one nation could put an object into lower Earth orbit that would rotate around the Earth, could they perhaps put weapons in outer space? Could they put surveillance technology in outer space? You are no longer safe in your own country. You are no longer safe in the sky because, literally, people feared that weapons and mass destruction would rain down from the heavens upon them. And this spurred the original space race, which originally the Soviet Union was ahead. They put the first satellite into space. They put the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. However, Soviet rocket technology eventually fell behind the pace of the Americans, and with Apollo 11, America was the first country to put a man on the moon in 1969. Eventually, the space race ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. However, it left behind a lasting legacy of the possible militarization of space, as well as the many technologies that came from it. So into military use. To understand why this is a concern of the international community, we must first understand what the threat was. The militarization is basically an umbrella term for military purposes. Not just weapons, but also things that will be used by the military. That includes military satellites, communication, as well as weapons that could possibly be put there. We'll start with military satellites. Originally, the Soviet Union was the first one to put a manned space station in low Earth orbit. These space stations had men, or cosmonauts as they were called, who would peer down through panels that were transparent and allow them to survey the basically countries. It was basically they were spying. And although they were proposed to be used for peaceful purposes, they were in fact used for military purposes. And eventually this was preceded by intelligence and communication satellites. These were no longer manned, but they were put in orbit to reflect communications band waves from one point of the Earth to another. And through this, we now have satellite phones, and these are widely used by our military. Another form of military use of outer space was satellite control, or ASAT as it is abbreviated. ASAT was a large term to be used in the 60s and the 70s when new satellites were being put into outer space. It was widely thought that if a nation could put a satellite in outer space that would carry nuclear warheads perhaps, that it would be necessary to have another weapon capable of shooting that satellite down. And for that purpose, ASAT weapons were developed. Recently, ASAT weapons were tested by Chinese. A defunct weather satellite was shot down by the Chinese missile that was later named SC-19 by the Americans. This was followed by the American test, which was largely seen as a response to the Chinese. As an SM-3, a modified anti-ballistic missile, was used against satellite that was falling out of orbit. And that also goes along with missile defense. Missile defense was a ballistic missile. As the V-2 rocket, the V-2 rocket was a space object. And in such, missile defense were other objects that we launched into space that would destroy missiles. These were not just other missiles, they were lasers. Many ideas were drafted. Few were actually used. SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, was the one that was eventually came up with the moniker of Star Wars. The American public mocked it, and it was a pet project of the Reagan administration. SDI was the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was supposed to allow the American military to shoot down missiles that would be incoming to the American homeland. Many ideas were used, not just lasers, but they also used charged particles and perhaps railguns. All these were eventually abandoned as ideas. The other program the Americans used was Nike. The Nike missiles program was specifically Nike Hercules. Nike Hercules was a small missile that would be used against incoming ballistic missiles that also had a nuclear warhead on it. These nuclear warheads would help to ensure that the kill was secured. Now, in more modern terms, strategic ballistic missiles are also considered space weapons. ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. Intercontinental ballistic missiles are launched through rockets into low Earth orbit and then use orbital velocity to reach their targets. Thus, these qualify as human man-made artifacts in outer space. The other thing is, in the future, Space Force application could also be possibly used. Now, these are the weapons that the international community does focus on now for prevention of. These are like space-based lasers or mass-to-target, kinetic bombardment. Lasers are no longer just fan fiction. They are also being used by the military currently to shoot down missiles, and they are being put on jets. They are in land-based emplacements, and that in the next coming decades, we can expect to see that perhaps these will be viable use on the battlefield as a tactical purpose. Mass-to-target weapons include something such as Project Thor. Project Thor was a United States Air Force project to put an orbital satellite in outer space that would basically drop tungsten telephone-sized rods and precise targets. Designed as bunker busters, these would travel at Mach 10 to the surface of the Earth and destroy whatever they were aiming at. As you can see, this is the United States space policy as of 2006. This was the Bush administration space policy. As you can read, it says, the United States considers space capabilities, including the ground and space segments and supporting links, vital to its national interests. Consistent with this policy, the United States will preserve its rights, capabilities, and freedoms of actions in space, as well as dissuade or deter others from either impeding these rights or developing capabilities intending to do so. Basically, the Bush administration took a very confrontational approach against other countries putting weapons or military hardware in outer space, and that any nation that wished to do so would be seen as an aggressor against the United States. And as such, the Bush administration also pursued many other forms of space weaponry that was also the means for international response. And as you can see, this is a retrieved from a RAND Corporation's research document on the various uses of these military hardware. Basically, there's everything from directed energy to kinetic energy and orbital bombardment. Now, these weapons were very, very useful, as the military describes outer space as the ultimate high ground, that no longer are enemies even safe in their own nations when you can rain destruction down upon them from outer space. Now here's what we shift to the peaceful purposes. Science. One of the major uses of outer space for peaceful purposes is science. The exploration of other celestial bodies, understanding the very concept of our universe. Many astrophysicists work on this day and night to try to understand. That's why we sent men to the moon. It's why we plan on sending men to Mars. And for that, many great and unique technologies have come from this sort of exploration. For instance, the flame retardant material used in the suits of firefighters came from the design of the astronauts' spacesuits, which were originally designed to be used in high oxygen content environments. The other form is unique experimentation. The various conditions and the environment that exist in outer space are unique to that area, and they do not exist on Earth. Basically, the most common one to be referenced is weightlessness, a low gravity environment. These low gravity environments do not exist naturally on Earth, but in low Earth orbit, they do exist and they can be used. Various experiments have taken place in outer space that could have only taken place there. That is what also the ISS, the International Space Station, is used for. There's also very many civilian applications of these technologies. As I explained, the flame retardant material that was used, as well as different types of toothpaste, in fact, which were designed to not cause crumbs or liquid droplets in outer space. There are many applications in civilian life that the technologies used in these space experimentations have led to. The other benefit of the peaceful use of outer space is international cooperation. The International Space Station is a joint project originally by the Soviet Union and the United States of America. However, that has expanded and it now encompasses many different space agencies around the world. Notable ones, contributors are the Japanese Space Agency, as well as the Canadian Space Industry, and the European Union Space Agency. Athena is the advanced telescope for high energy astrophysics. And this is a joint program by Japan, the EU, and America. And what it does is it puts together decades and decades of research into a proposed plan to put a telescope that would, in outer space that would not just simply look at celestial bodies, but also examine the various types of radiation that are emitted from them to determine how large space is, how deep it is, how far we can go. And the possibilities are basically unlimited. The other current issue, though, is international conflict. As stated by one treaty that was written up by the United Nations, the Outer Space Treaty, space is the province of all mankind. It has no bounds in terms of sovereignty to any nation, and it cannot be claimed. Therefore, these space programs, only certain nations have space programs. There are probably, count them on two of your hands. And therefore, nations that do not have a space program feel left out. That if only 5, 10 of these large, wealthy, technologically advanced countries have access to this unlimited resource, and they do not, surely they would wish to limit the amounts of which other countries can use it, especially for military purposes. As well as sovereignty. Sovereignty was another main issue. The Outer Space Treaty specifies that celestial bodies cannot be claimed by any one country, and that you are not to put any form of military hardware involving weapons of mass destruction on them. And therefore, various programs involving the Soviet Union and the United States originally planned to put moon bases, or as well as military installations in outer space. This various type of colonization goes against the Outer Space Treaty, in which outer space and all the bodies in it belong to everyone, not just a single country. And that goes along with arms races. Arms races where that if one country puts some form of military hardware in outer space, some country will try to put something else up there to counter it, and then so on and so forth. And an arms race begins. If one country puts nuclear weapons in outer space, another country will put nuclear arms in outer space. And then you have a very big problem. Here are the peaceful efforts that have been made to counter that. The Outer Space Treaty, as I've already discussed, it bans nuclear weapons in outer space, as well as other weapons of mass destruction. Various countries have decidedly found loopholes to go around this, as I noted. But these loopholes exist as in that if you can't put a nuclear weapon in outer space, the treaty does not specifically ban conventional weapons in outer space. And therefore, Project Thor, which was allowing tungsten rods to be launched down at Earth, those are not banned by this treaty, as they are not weapons of mass destruction. However, as well as the lasers described, the only ones that you're basically not allowed to put in is nuclear. And countries still have put ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads into outer space. So it's not exactly a perfect treaty. The other treaty, which is determined to be a failed treaty, is the Moon Treaty. And basically this one's more comprehensive than the Outer Space Treaty in that it bans every single type of military hardware in outer space. No moon bases, no conventional weapons, no nothing. The outer space and all celestial bodies are specifically for peaceful purposes only. However, this treaty only has 13 ratifications and very few parties to it. And in fact, no nation with spacefaring technology or capability has ratified it. So therefore, it has been basically useless for the past 30 years. But for the future promotion and prevention of arms races, for the promotion of peaceful uses, we do know it has great scientific boons to use outer space. The very scientific cooperation between the Russians, the United States, the European Union, Canada, is a very evidence of this. That nations have come together where one single nation cannot simply afford or have the technological capabilities to put men on Mars or to put probes beyond the reaches of our solar system. However, through cooperation between multiple nations, we can do that. And then in promotion of this peaceful use of outer space and through cooperation, we mitigate the chances of having an arms race. Because no one is specifically competing against another when they are all working together. Also for the prevention of an arms races, there are historical treaties, such as SALT and SALT II, as well as other disarmament treaties, that have led to the lessening of levels of ballistic missiles, as well as other types of weapons that would be used against them. That includes also the ASAT weapons, or the satellite control. Therefore, these are comprehensive disarmament treaties involving not just weapons of mass destruction, but also weapons in outer space. More recently, however, the new President of the United States, President Obama, has released a new space policy. This one replaces the Bush Doctrine in that it takes a less confrontational approach to international relations and scientific cooperation. No longer will the United States simply be the sole belligerent of a conflict in outer space, but instead seeks international cooperation in terms of scientific advancement, as well as cooperation in exploring the farther reaches of outer space. As I said, one nation simply does not have the resources to do such feats as putting men on Mars or putting probes beyond our solar system. However, if we work together, we will come much closer. I have response questions, and if you'd like to think about them for further study, the first one was, what do you believe are the possibilities and the costs of benefits of having military infrastructure in outer space? Basically, what can our country benefit from putting weapons in outer space? It is the ultimate high ground, but what would the cost of that be? International retaliation? Perhaps an arms race? You have to do the costs and the benefits. The second question is, do you believe that a military presence in outer space is inevitable? Some people do. Some people believe that, like Star Trek, like Star Wars, that in the future, that the weaponization of outer space is inevitable, and that human strife and conflict will eventually reach the stars. Do you believe that is true? Why or why not? And third, if we fail to prevent an arms race in outer space, what could the future repercussions for the world be, and for us as individuals? That in the grand scheme of time, human lives are rather short, but if we are to perhaps pollute our outer space orbit with debris from war, or if we are to perhaps irradiate the Earth so much that we can no longer live here and now we have to move to another planet. Basically, these might all be fantasy now, but in the next 100 to 200 years, many technologies will be open to us that we can't even dream of now. And I just wanted everyone to think about that. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Next up, debating the issue of achieving peace and stability in Somalia, is Jabran Samla. This is also Jabran's first year in MUN, but he has already attended SoCal MUN and MUN-DC and Santa Barbara Intercollegiate MUN. In addition to being part of the Outstanding Delegation Awards at Santa Barbara and Washington, D.C., Jabran won a position paper award at D.C. Jabran plans on attending Georgetown University to major in political sciences in hopes of becoming a federal attorney or politician. Please welcome Jabran Samla.
Take it.
Yeah, just pause it, and then I'm going to do my other.
5, 4, 3, 2.
Thank you, Pia. My name is Jabran Samla. I'll be talking about achieving peace and stability in Somalia.
Imagine a world where everyone's living in peace. It's really hard to imagine that for now. But someday, I hope you will join us and see the world as one. Martin Luther King Jr. said that in his protest. Achieving peace and stability everywhere in the world is not an easy task to do. Despite the fact major nations like the United States of America are in war against terrorism, illegal activities, and threats to peace are still ruling our planet. However, the progress has been made since the last couple of years in many countries, including USA itself, by capturing and killing Osama bin Laden, an international and extreme terrorist. However, there is one nation in the international community that is facing an unstable government since the last 3 decades, and that is the Federal Republic of Somalia. The nation has about 10 million people in it who are facing and suffering because of corrupt government, terrorism, and arms dealers. The situation of instability in Somalia started during the 1970s during the presidency of Siad Barre, a dictator-style leader. After he stepped into office, the destruction of political, social, and economic roots started, which led the civilians to suffer because of hunger and sudden deaths. The primary problem that arose due to this unstable peace and stability situation in Somalia was a problem of terrorism. The leading terrorist group, known by the name of Al-Shabaab, migrated into the country during 1980s and 1990s through the unmilitarized and unsecured border of Somalia. Now, the United Nations, being the third party and supporter for every nation in the world, passed resolutions for the betterment of Somalia. Security Council, a primary body of the United Nations, passed Resolution 1846 and 1851 in 2008, enforcing combat piracy on Somalia's coast, which is the main route for the terrorists to go into Somalia and cause trouble for peace and instability. Moreover, Resolution 733 placed a complete arms embargo on the country, which means heavy artillery which was being sent to the non-state actors was completely stopped in Somalia. However, by 1992, Somalia was claimed to be the world's #1 failed state and a threat to international security by the United States of America. Furthermore, of course, the United States aid to every nation in the world pretty much, and Somalia is one of them. The essential goal of U.S. aid in Somalia is to increase stability through targeted interventions, economic recovery, and reduce the appeal of extremism. Now, USA, being the country on war with terrorism, with other nations like France and the United Kingdom, is affected by terrorism. Now, in order to make its war on terrorism successful, it has to comply with other nations. The main question being asked by several U.S. citizens is that, how does helping Somalia affect the Americans? Now, let me answer that for you in a second. Yes, we do have stake in Somalia and even in other African nations like Senegal and Mauritania. But still, what does it have to do with the American economy in the international community? Now, Al-Shabaab, the terrorist group, is fighting against Somalia's federal government. But there is only one nation outside the African Union who is making actively solid moves against Al-Shabaab, and that is the United States of America. Al-Shabaab, with other non-state actors, is trying to block the international trade, which affects the USA in a high percentage number. Since USA is one of the leading members in trade organization and imports and exports are highly important to USA, in consideration to war on terrorism, the United States of America cannot let its economy and international community suffer from trade. Africa is home to 6 of the top 10 fastest growing countries in the world. According to International Trade Organization, Sub-Saharan Africa now receives up to $21 billion exports from the United States of America, which is why this is important to United States of America's citizens. President Obama, however, said in his speech, "We are responding to African regional economic communities by reducing barriers to trade and investment." Now, the problem that comes to terrorism is not only the issue of trade. It is anything that government does, and terrorists are against it, including education. Since Somalia is a failed state, so it is not surprising to say that their education system is not progressive at all. Only about 22.1% people in Somalia are literate, with students dropping out of school within 2 to 3 years. President Obama said, "Improving the quality of and expanding access to adult education, literacy, and career could help the African nations like Somalia and improve its conditions." United Nations, in total compliance with the United States of America, formed a committee for children in Somalia called Children's Rights Convention, CRC, which focuses on dropping the illiteracy rate in the nation.
United States of America, however, alongside with the international community, highly agrees with the fact that even child soldiers are generated by terrorists, and USA is against it. International community believes that there are child soldiers because children do not have enough knowledge about these topics, which is why they can be easily manipulated. USA and the rest of the international community are against terrorism and its detrimental effects on trade and our future generation. With that being said, let's talk about some solutions or possible steps that the international community could take in order to prevent terrorism in Somalia, protect its borders, and save the international trade. Let's talk about America first. What have America done so far to prevent terrorism? One of the most effective steps that was taken by Bush administration in 2002 was to identify, locate, and destroy terrorists and their organization. Moreover, number two, deny sponsorship and support to terrorists and any other state who have terrorists in their nation, and if they're not ready to comply with the United States or the rest of the international community. The greatest solution proposes to partner up with the international community and strengthen the weak nations and prevent terrorism. Somalia, along with other African nations, is seeking the international assistance and taking cohesive measures and actually acting upon the resolution previously passed by the United Nations is the most extensive and effective measure to be taken by the international community to prevent terrorism in the coast of Somalia. Moreover, another extensive measure that could be enforced is to enforce United Nations peacekeepers in Somalia. What that is, United Nations missions are there to prevent terrorism and maintain peace and stability. For example, UN MITS, United Nations Mission in South Sudan, which is enforced in South Sudan, a newly independent nation in 2011. We already have about 30,000 peacekeepers in Somalia for the purpose of humanitarian aid. So why not have more to prevent terrorism and maintain peace and stability in the world's #1 failed state? The problem of piracy and terrorism in Somalia is on peak right now. In 2011, there were about 176 launched terrorist attacks. However, the Security Council passed 2 resolutions that authorizes the use of all necessary measures, allowing the member state to control the coastal rivers of Somalia, of course by the permission of the national government in compliance with the national sovereignty, in order to combat piracy and terrorism. Furthermore, UN Security Council emphasizes on the fact that due to the help of USA, Russia, and European Union, Somalia has improved in the past couple of years. Based on the resolution 2067, which was passed in 2012, the Security Council looks forward on the role of the new Somali government under Hassan Sheikh Mohammed and how it plays a critical role in future of lasting peace and stability. Roadmap of transparent locations for finance and trade is one of the solutions that government is responsible for that, and the national security. So, therefore, Al-Shabaab could be obviously destroyed by using United States' previous tactics, also enacting and recalling previous laws regarding peace and stability created by United Nations around the world should be reaffirmed in Somalia, and Somalia shouldn't be a failed state anymore, because it is a home for many successful nations in the form of trade, imports, and exports. So I therefore believe Somalia shouldn't be called the #1 failed state anymore by any other nation or anyone else. In fact, it's our responsibility to protect and maintain peace and stability in the nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gibran, for that analysis of Somalia. Our next topic is strengthening human rights of returnees and internally displaced persons, or IDPs, in conflict-ridden regions. And here to discuss it is Naziha Kabria. Naziha has gone to several MUN conferences over the past few years, including MNUN FW in San Francisco and NMUN New York. She plans on attending law school to study international human rights law. Here is Naziha Kabria.
Thank you, Theo. So I'm going to be talking about strengthening the human rights of returnees and internally displaced people in conflict-ridden regions. So this is one of the topics that's going to be discussed in New York for the United Nations Human Rights Council. So I just want to go really quickly over what the Human Rights Council does. It was established on March 15, 2006, so it's a relatively new council, and it doesn't have much precedent in terms of actions that it's done. It's only had 6 years, approximately, to go through any really major actions, but it is preceded by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, so that's an older committee that was discussing similar issues before, and is not really working right now, so now we have the Human Rights Council. And it's established to discuss and protect basic human rights, which are enumerated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a very important document in international relations, and also basically affects how different countries deal with human rights and stuff like that. And it basically, the way the United Nations Human Rights Council works is it elects members from different regions of the world, and they come together and they discuss human rights. And it's an elected position, so they rotate. So another really important part of this topic and this discussion is going to be internally displaced persons. An internally displaced person is basically somebody who is like a refugee. They've left a region, usually due to conflict. They've left it to move to a different region, but they have not necessarily, or they definitely have not left the borders of the country. So the official definition is persons or groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or leave their homes or place of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict situation, of generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters who have not crossed internationally recognized state borders. And right now there are over 26 million internationally displaced peoples, or IDPs for short, in over 50 countries. So to give you kind of a big notion of how many people that is larger than the number of people in Texas. So that's a huge population, in my opinion, of the world who have been forced to leave their homes because of, violence or conflict, or sometimes even environmental disasters. And so then the other part of this discussion will be returnees. And a returnee is basically a refugee or IDP who has decided to return to their place of residence. A refugee is officially owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, memberships of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside of his country of nationality, and is unable to, or owing to such a fear, is unwilling to avail himself to the protection of that country. So the big distinction between a refugee and an IDP is that a refugee will leave their country of origin and will leave national borders, thereby subjecting themselves to international law and the laws of other countries. And basically, these two groups are going to be really central to this discussion that we're going to be having today. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was something I talked about earlier. It's a really important document. I just want to talk about some of the major articles of it that we're going to be looking at in this discussion. Basically, the first one is Article 3, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. And this is going to be relevant because a lot of times people, especially refugees, will be fleeing an area because they lack that security of person. They're being persecuted for, like I stated earlier, because of the religion or political preference. So it's really important that we do ensure that they don't get persecuted. The other one is Article 25.1. Everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being for himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social service, the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, and other lack of livelihoods in circumstances beyond his control. This is a little bit more of a controversial article inside the Universal Declaration of Human Rights because it does tend to bend a little bit more towards socialism. But it is important because what we will see is a lot of the times in refugee camps, or as a result of having to leave behind their property, a lot of the refugees and IDPs don't have access to any of these basics, like sanitary water. They don't have access to medical care, so it's really important that those issues are addressed. So really quickly, here's some statistics for internally displaced people, and these are within the country. So we have Afghanistan, which has almost 500,000, Bangladesh, which is undetermined, Colombia, which has the largest number of IDPs, ranging between 3,876,000 and 5,454,766. That is a significant population. And then we have the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which has 1.71 million. India, which has about 500,000. Iraq, which has 2,300,000. Between that and 2,600,000. Israel, which is undetermined. Libya, which is 74,000. Pakistan, 900,000. Rwanda has an undetermined amount. Somalia, which has 1.5 million. South Sudan, which doesn't have a determined amount. Sri Lanka, which has 115,000. Sudan, which has 2,200,000. Syria, which has 2 million. In Uganda, which has 30,000. And Zimbabwe, which has undetermined. As you can see from this list, this is just a small portion of the IDP population, but as you can see from this list, a lot of them have undetermined populations of IDPs, which makes it really difficult to track them down and have sufficient resources for them. And also, as you can see from looking at this list, a lot of these countries are not really developed and don't have a lot of substantial resources. So that's also going to be something that we're going to be discussing, because these countries don't necessarily have the infrastructure or economic stability to be supporting a large population which is displaced and not in their homes and oftentimes living in poverty. And almost all these are leaving their regions because of a very central political or economic conflict or whatever it is. And because of that, they can't go back home because of the violence. So that's going to be something that we're going to be discussing and considering. Okay, so some of the major problems faced by IDPs are, because they are similar to refugees, they have similar problems, and they're especially vulnerable to violations of civil rights, political rights, economic rights, social rights, and cultural rights. And they're also especially vulnerable to human rights abuses. A lot of times these are the people you'll see being trafficked and being sold into very terrible things like sex slave, and occasionally they'll be, a lot of the children will be turned into child soldiers. So that's not okay on any level. And also, because they have not actually crossed any international borders, a lot of problems they're facing is that they're not really subject to international law, and they don't get a lot of the benefits that refugees get because they've never entered the international sphere and they're still domestic. So some other concerns are that basically when you're forced to leave a region or leave your home because of conflict, a lot of communities face, or a lot of IDPs and refugees face loss of, from losing their property, losing their family status and employment, but also they're leaving their community. So that's very important to them. And a lot of times they lose important legal documents, which can give them identification. And basically it makes it easier for the government to track them and give them important services, but they can't because there's no legal documentation. A lot of them have been lost due to the conflict and due to the violence in the area. And then once you do get them to come back home and return home, there is this whole problem of how you're going to reintegrate them. So a lot of times they face problems because they are traveling through war zones, and they're going to have problems recovering lost property that they had to leave behind. And then a lot of times they're going to have lost family members, or they're going to have trouble reconnecting with family members who they lost contact with due to the conflict. So I'm going to be talking about three specific cases of major IDP situations and refugee situations. The three I'm going to be talking about are Colombia, Iraq, and Sudan. So Colombia has, as we saw earlier, one of the largest IDP populations. And it's significant because it's a large portion of their population. A lot of these people are fleeing due to armed conflict involving the indigenous peoples. And while the government has attempted to implement solutions, most of the internally displaced people inside the region have yet to benefit from it, mostly because there's a lack of stability in the region and a lack of infrastructure, because it's a conflict-ridden region and it's a poor region. So what we'll see in international relations is conflict-ridden regions and poor nations don't really have the resources to support a displaced population, providing them with medical care, with housing, with food, and then on top of that, later reintegrating them into society. And these people, especially with IDPs, like I said earlier, they're not outside of the state of Colombia, they're within Colombia, so they don't have access to, like refugees would, foreign aid. A lot of the times they don't have access to NGOs and stuff like that, and it's all very dependent on the state and government of Colombia and whether they're willing to help these people. And so what we can see here in this chart is that one of the major causes of the main perpetrators of displacement. So basically it's showing which groups force these people to move because of the violence in the region. And basically we see like it's not just one group that's fighting, it's all these groups, and so it's a very complex situation with resolving the violence and then bringing the people back into the area, because a lot of times we'll notice is that people do come back when the violence stops. And we'll see that, for example, there are certain groups which are more significant than others, like the FARC, which is resulting in over 25%, and the AUC, which is resulting in over 30% of the displacement. And over here we have the different causes of displacement, and so what we're seeing here is that one of the major causes of displacement, not only in this region, but also we'll see in other regions, is direct threats on life. So that's obviously going to be a violation of the Article 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which we talked about earlier, talking about the security of person. And we see here that over 50% of the people were displaced because of direct threats on their life. And even more disturbing and disconcerting is that almost 10% have been displaced because of massacres, and also a little bit over 10% are displaced because of assassinations of family members. So this is becoming like a deeply rooted problem, and a lot of people are dying because of it, and a lot of people are being displaced and their lives are being ruined because of it. So it's obviously something that the Colombian government can't ignore, but also that the international government, especially, or the international community, especially a community concerned with human rights, can't ignore. So now we're going to talk about Iraq. Iraq has been in a case of, in a state of turmoil for a while. It started out with, of course, the Saddam Hussein regime, which we know a lot about in the United States because of the post 9/11 Iraqi war and Afghani war. But this conflict had been existing before then. We had the Saddam Hussein regime, which was tyrannical and a lot of times was perpetrating violence. And there was also the conflict between the Shiite and Sunni groups, which are the two major Muslim factions, and they were fighting for control of the government, as well as, the U.S. troops coming in and there being the Iraqi war. The Hussein regime caused a lot of displacement by persecuting the Kurds, who are an ethnic group, and a lot of them moved. And then also in 2011, the Iraqi government also decided to quadruple spending on displaced people. So that's a significant step in the right direction for the Iraqi government, because they are channeling money into having displaced people return to their home and be reintegrated. But there is a major problem here that 80% of the internally displaced people, or the IDPs, said that they would rather stay in the location they were displaced to than return to their place of origin, and that is, of course, due to continued violence and, of course, better lifestyles. But this is a concern because a lot of times the IDPs will move to areas that don't have the infrastructure to support such a large population. Another thing about Iraq specifically is that they have a large population, not only that has been internally displaced, but they also have a large population of refugees that have left their country because of the area or because of the conflict, and they have left into countries surrounding the area like Pakistan and Iran. This is a concern because a lot of times countries that they flee to, as we can see, Iraq may not necessarily be a very economically stable country right now, and they're fleeing to other areas that may not have the infrastructure to support them, and we'll see this more with Sudan. And then also we can see that with the Iraqi government is that they can't force the people to move back. And a lot of the people that were displaced and need to be returning are returning to areas like Baghdad, which of course was a central point of conflict during the war. And so they don't, they're of course focusing on rebuilding, and they also have to focus on this huge refugee returning population and this huge internally displaced population. So they're going to have some time, or they're going to be struggling with the balance of that. And now looking at Sudan, this is a huge population in Sudan was displaced because of the war within Sudan and Darfur, the genocide in Darfur. So with the creation of South Sudan, there's a lot of fluctuation of people, and that of course will impact the IDP population. We have 2.2 million IDPs in Sudan, and a lot of times also with refugees in Sudan is that they move to neighboring areas, but Sudan is not in a very economically stable area anyways. So what happens is that they're moving to other areas, and those areas can't support refugee populations. So as they can't support refugee populations, a lot of times they're kicking the refugees back out of their country or forcing them to return to their home country. And the home country may still be in a state of economic or political turmoil, and they may still be in a conflict area. One of the common things that we're seeing with all these issues is that, or with all these countries, is that there's a lack of infrastructure, but also that all these IDPs and refugees will stem from conflict and violence. And a lot of this violence has to do with unstable governments and also unstable economics. As you know, if you ever study international relations, you'll see that there's a direct relation between the economic stability and political stability. So that's really significant, and like the best way to solve these issues would be to, of course, address those underlying causes. But also with IDP populations, it's really important to, as they've started doing, create commissions that deal specifically with them, because of course they're not subject to international law, and that raises a really important question of where the importance lies, whether it lies with protecting human rights, or whether it lies with protecting the human rights of the IDPs, or whether it belongs with the governments and protecting the national sovereignty. It's a really important balance to strike, because of course you don't want these countries to feel that you are overruling their sovereignty and that you're basically delegitimizing their government, because they're trying to regain stability at the same time. But you do still need to provide them with the resources they need to support these IDP populations and also these refugee populations.